Mullengarden, and I'm the Education Director for the Birmingham Holocaust Education Center. Tonight's program is co-sponsored by the Gulf Coast Center for Holocaust and Human Rights Education in Mobile. Together, we serve as the educational arm of the Alabama Holocaust Commission. Our hope in planning many months ago was to bring Christina Chavarria to Alabama for a week of in-person learning. But since the pandemic is still with us, Christina is joining us online from DC tonight and again on Thursday, April the 1st for a teacher workshop. I would also like to thank HICA, the Hispanic Interest Coalition of Alabama, for helping us to publicize this event. During the program tonight, everyone will remain muted, but we welcome your questions during and after the presentation via the chat box. Please remember that whatever you type in that box will be sent by default to the whole group unless you specify a specific recipient. After our lecture, we will have a period for questions, which I will take from that chat box and direct to our guest. This program will be recorded and posted on the BHEC website, so we thank you for your cooperation. I first met Christina Chavarria in 2014 while attending the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Conference for Holocaust Education Centers, or CHEC as it is known. Christina was one of the presenters who spoke on engaging new audiences. From the museum's archives, she had pulled a child's drawing of a map depicting his journey from Nazi-controlled Europe to South America. She was researching the push and pull factors of this young refugee and why he was forced to leave, that is what pushed him out, and why did his family choose to go to South America, that is what pulled him there. I was first drawn in by the power of this child's drawings, that it was a historical document. The journey of this refugee family was a reminder that the Holocaust was a global crisis, touching almost every continent. Whoever thinks about South America when we speak about the Holocaust? But the focus of Christina's talk was engaging new audiences, something the BHEC continues to explore. How do we as educators help audiences find relevancy in a history that's not really their own? How do we introduce the study of the Holocaust to audiences who do not see themselves in this history? With a subject this vast, everyone has a different entry point. So as educators, we seek different topics, different modalities, different stories to engage different audiences. And so that brings us to our speaker tonight. Christina Chavarria is a program coordinator in the Levine Institute for Holocaust Education at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where she has worked since 2006. She holds a BA in English and American Literature from the University of Texas at El Paso and a Master of Arts in Comparative Literature from the University of Dallas. She was a high school English teacher for 9 years in El Paso, Texas, her city of birth. Later, she served as the Director of Education at Holocaust Museum Houston for 6.5 years. Her interests lie in Holocaust literature, engaging new audiences and partners, and studying and disseminating information on the impact and history of the Holocaust in Spain, Latin America, and the U.S. Latino population. She has forged relationships for the museum with organizations such as the U.S. Department of Education, the National Archives and Records Administration, the U.S. Department of State, museums within the Smithsonian Institution, and Holocaust organizations in Latin America. Christina currently facilitates the Conference for Holocaust Education Centers, CHEC, that I mentioned previously. In this capacity, she works closely with 50 different Holocaust organizations from around the country, including the BHEC, providing opportunities for these centers to learn about museum resources and pedagogical approaches. CHEC also serves as a valuable networking vehicle for these centers, so we greatly appreciate the work that she is doing with CHEC. Christina is also part of a small team of the museum staff who is overseeing the museum's implementation of HR 943, the Never Again Act. This will implement Holocaust education around the United States over the next 5 years. So welcome, Christina, and I will turn the program over to you.
And thank you so much for this very, very gracious introduction. And I would like to thank the Alabama Holocaust Commission for this invitation to speak with you this evening. I'm absolutely honored to do so. And as Anne mentioned, when I was first invited to speak with you all, it was to be in person. And I just want to say that even though we cannot be together in person and I cannot be in Alabama, I want to congratulate our partners in Alabama because they have worked so hard alongside with us and with the other members of the Conference for Holocaust Education Centers, or CHAC, to continue to bring programming and education to the audiences that they serve. And it is a somber anniversary that we're in this week and next week, with the first year in which so many of us had to go home and start to work from home and teach our children at home, and to also, some of us may have had to go out and work with very little protection against the pandemic. And there were just so many of these unknowns. And I want to say that in that first week that we all had to pivot to go to a work from home situation, that all of the organizations, the Holocaust organizations around the country that are part of this program, the CHEC program, we met one day, and I remember it was the 19th of March, and we thought it would be a one-time meeting just to kind of check in on each other. And we ended up meeting every 2 weeks for the last year. And so our Alabama partners are absolutely critical to us, and to reach new audiences, but also to remain engaged in bringing Holocaust education and Holocaust memory to not only the Alabama region, but the Gulf Coast region, to various audiences in the South and even beyond. And I know that tonight I see some familiar names of people who are coming from outside of Alabama. And that was the silver lining of this pandemic, is that we have been able to reach people that maybe could not come to Washington. And even though we remain closed, we are very much engaged online with you. And so we encourage you to go to our website, ushmm.org, and also to follow us on social media, but to follow us also through our partners in Alabama, because we're in this together. And we could not share the information that I'm going to share with you this evening had it not been for working with our wonderful partners. And I just want to say that I'm incredibly touched that you remember the drawing. Now, the drawing that the little boy did that Anne mentioned, I'm not sharing it this evening, but I will be sharing it in the teacher workshop in April. So I encourage you, because we're all teachers now, so many of us, and we've had to learn to teach our children at home. We encourage you to sign up for that workshop, because we're going to look even more closely at different countries in Latin America and how they responded to the refugee crisis, starting off with that really moving drawing that I hope will draw you to the workshop. So I am going to start a PowerPoint. So I'm going to share my screen with everybody. And as Anne said, to please put your comments or your questions into the chat box, if you would, and then we'll get to them later. So when we look at Latin America, quite often the first comment I get is, what about the perpetrators who went there? What about Adolf Eichmann, who was probably the most famous or the most infamous of the perpetrators, who fled to South America, who was kidnapped by the Mossad in Argentina. And this talk is not focused on the perpetrators, but I do want to say that the museum, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, we do a lot of collecting of the evidence of the Holocaust around the world. And we have some very significant projects taking place in Latin America, in which we are working with various partners in many countries in Latin America to gather the evidence of the Holocaust, to bring it to the museum here, so that scholars and researchers and anybody who's interested can come to the museum or come to us online, because we are digitizing so many of our collections, and do this research. And Latin America has a very distinct history, as do so many parts of the world. And when we look at the Holocaust, because we have to go beyond looking at the perpetrators. And my own research has been so illuminating through the records that we have collected, because it really does lay bare so much more of refugees and the attempts to find a place, a safe haven, when the world was closing its doors. So for this evening, because Latin America is not one country, but so many countries, for this evening, we're going to focus primarily on 2 countries, but I will also talk about some of the other countries south of the Rio Grande. But the Dominican Republic and Mexico will really be the topic of tonight's discussion. And the 2 pictures that you see here in this opening slide, the one on the left is a picture of passengers on a boat called the Kwanzaa that actually went to Mexico before it came to the United States in September of 1940. You're going to learn more about the Kwanzaa in a bit. And then the picture on the right is of an Austrian Jewish refugee in Sosua in the Dominican Republic, and you'll hear more about him and his collection. So if you haven't been to the museum, we are on the National Mall, and we are a reminder among all of the monuments to American democracy that we need to remember that democracy is fragile, and that it is difficult, it is challenging to uphold democratic principles in many cases, and the Holocaust is a case study in which we need to remember how a democracy went and slid into being a dictatorship. So at the museum, we are very concerned with this central question: how and why did the Holocaust happen? The how part is one that we're digging into very deeply, and we are looking at different responses of different groups. We are looking at the role of propaganda. We are looking at the role of collaborators in how they contributed to the outcomes of this history. The why part is something that we may never be able to answer fully, but it is a question that we continue to investigate through the records that we are collecting all over the world. Why didn't European Jews leave the continent and go elsewhere? This is a very common question that students ask teachers. It is a very common question that teachers ask us. And it is a very common question that visitors to the museum will ask. Why didn't they leave when the persecution began, when the Nuremberg laws were put into place? And that's what we're going to do this evening, is we're going to look at places where they could have gone in the attempts to leave and what some of those roadblocks were. And again, I encourage you to take part in the teacher workshop in April, because we're going to delve more deeply into that question and then look at the responses of 5 Latin American countries. And again, as I mentioned, we have to understand the global responses to the Holocaust in regard to refugees who are trying to find a safe place, especially in a time when we are coming out of a depression, an economic depression that was worldwide, or in many cases, we're sliding back into a recession. And we also want to look at the different refugee policies of countries. But again, for this evening, we're looking at 2 countries in particular. But what we're also doing is we're looking at the lens through the United States. And right now at the museum, even though we are temporarily closed, we have at the museum and we have online an overwhelmingly profound exhibit that's called Americans in the Holocaust. And this is our opportunity to help our audiences understand how Americans, whether it was individual Americans or organizations or elected leaders, or even the president himself at the time, President Roosevelt, the different responses to the growing Nazi threat. How was the United States and how were Americans responding to the growing refugee crisis in the 1930s and 1940s? How were they responding to the threats of war? And then how are they responding once the war did begin in 1939? What were the debates that were occurring between those who felt that we should go to war and we should join the war with the Allied powers, or that we should avoid going to war after the significant losses in World War I. But what we also do in this exhibit and through some of our online materials is we look at how minorities in the United States were being treated at that time. We have a lot of information on the Jim Crow South and the treatment of Black Americans and Black Americans' responses. And what we now have through our History Unfolded project is we are collecting newspaper articles that deal with the repatriation, which is a euphemism, it was really deportation, of Mexican Americans, Americans of Mexican descent who were born in the United States and thus US citizens, and some of their family members who were born in Mexico, how they were forced to go back to Mexico. So I'll talk about that a little later on, because that provides a lens for us to see the broader picture of how we were responding to what's happening in Europe and looking at the way that minorities in the United States were being treated. And we're going to look at the diary of Anthony Acevedo. The story is very profound. He is the first Mexican-American to register with us as a survivor of Nazi persecution. So I will talk about him a little later. So where do we begin? We know that the Holocaust, as we define it, starts in 1933 with the Nazi rise to power and Hitler being named chancellor. But for the purposes of time, we're going to start with the beginning, really, of the refugee crisis in the late 1930s. And where we start right here is with the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria as part of the Third Reich, which was generally peaceful. There was no big army forceful takeover at the time. But what happened was that everything that had been happening in the last 5 years, all of the persecution, all of the anti-Semitic decrees that had fallen upon German Jews for the last 5 years, from 1933 through 1938, overnight now came upon Austrian Jews, since Austria was now annexed as part of the Third Reich. So this creates a flurry of visa applications and consulates throughout Austria, in Vienna primarily, where you see more and more European Jews in the Third Reich applying for visas to go almost anywhere that they could go, as immigration restriction was pretty tight by this point, especially here in the United States after the 1920s, especially in 1924, with the immigration restriction laws that we had. So in July of 1938, President Roosevelt calls for a conference to be held in Evian, France, to look at the growing refugee crisis. But he also promises all of the countries that attend that they will not be asked to increase their quotas to take in more refugees than whom they already have. And the Evian conference is pretty much a failure and a signal that the world has closed its doors on refugees. And we have this particular illustration that appeared in the New York Times. It also appeared in other newspapers around the world. And we can see that the person in the middle, it says non-Aryan, but we can tell by the kippah that they're referring to Jewish refugees. That this is a very critical question. 32 nations sent representatives to the Evian conference. Nobody from President Roosevelt's cabinet attended. Two American gentlemen attended, James McDonald and Myron Taylor. And only one country came forward during the Evian conference to say that it would take in more refugees, and it promised to take up to 100,000 Jewish refugees. And that one country was the Dominican Republic. And the reality of the Dominican Republic is that it didn't necessarily live up to the promise of taking in 100,000 refugees. In the end, probably less than 5,000 visas were issued for people to go, for refugees to go to the DR. But we're not even sure that all 5,000 people actually did go there. And why did the Dominican Republic do this? That is a big question for this history. Rafael Trujillo was the dictator, the man in power, the president of the Dominican Republic at the time. And his reasons for doing so were not really based on any kind of humanitarian impulse. He had overseen and had ordered the massacre of thousands of Haitians in the Dominican Republic in 1937. This created a great outcry, a great international outcry throughout the global community. So he needed something that would rehabilitate his image on the global stage. So that was the main reason why he said that he would take in refugees. And he even donated land that he owned in the northern part, the northern tip of the Dominican Republic. And this was a community called Sosua. So I'm going to go to the next slide here. And the United States actually helped to support this effort. Even though we weren't taking in a large number of refugees, we were not increasing our quotas. We did support this project through some funding, and also the American Joint Distribution Committee also put in money. The Jewish Relief Agency gave money toward this project to help bring refugees from Germany and Austria, Jewish refugees, to the Dominican Republic. And they established this organization called the Dominican Republic Settlement Association, or DORSA, that would work to help train the refugees who were coming over to help to learn the agricultural trade. That is a big part of this history, is that when you look at Latin America did not want, in large part, they did not want to take in refugees who were white-collar workers, college degree professionals, for example. They wanted more agricultural workers. And that really went against the grain of the professions of most of the refugees who wanted to go to Latin America, or who were attempting to go, because they did not have that kind of agricultural background. Many of them came from cities like Vienna and Berlin, and they tended to be white-collar workers. So they were not at first attractive prospects to be given visas, but it was through DORSA that they were able to work to provide the kind of training and Spanish language instruction to learn how to speak Spanish, to bring the refugees over to DORSA, to settle, to start this agricultural settlement in Sosua. But also what happens was, it was a very slow process in order to acquire a visa. And at one point, this whole idea of Sosua almost fails in 1940, because the land ended up being very difficult to settle and to grow crops. But they pursued it, and they kept going, and they were able to be successful in their dairy farming, and also in growing different types of fruits due to the humid climate. But it was still a very, very difficult struggle for a lot of the refugees. So what we're going to look at here is this particular family, the Blumenstein family. The husband's name is Franz, the wife is Elsa, and the little boy is Heinz. They are Viennese Jews, and Franz owns a perfume factory. So here we see them in the backdrop where they're very well dressed. They look like they are a family of some means. And what we're looking at here is the fact that this is a family that will experience some of the major events of 1938 and 1939 in the history of the Holocaust, and how their story intersects with Latin American refuge. So this is Franz's date book that we have in our archives. And the Anschluss took place in these dates. And this is his date book during the time that Germany basically comes into Austria and annexes Austria as part of the Third Reich. And if you look at the bottom of his date book, he's listing Santiago, Chile, for example. And so this starts to give us a lens into his mindset that he's starting to consider places to go to, Santiago, Chile being one of them. So his family is in Vienna in November 1938, and by this time they have lost their business and they don't have as much money anymore, and money has become very tight for them. In November 9th and 10th, the pogrom, what we call the November pogrom, organized violence against Jews, takes place in these 2 days and nights, and now we refer to it as Kristallnacht. And this is the destruction of Jewish-owned property, of synagogues throughout Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland. And this is when Jewish males are rounded up en masse because they are Jewish, and they are sent in large numbers to the concentration camps. And Franz is sent to Dachau. And his wife, Elsa, is only able to secure him to make sure that he's able to leave Dachau and secure his release, because she's able to cobble up enough money to bribe the prison officials, only under the condition that she can also show that her husband will leave the country as soon as possible. So this is a chance for the family to leave together. But unfortunately, they don't have enough money to secure passage on a boat for all three of the family members, and also for Franz's mother, who at the time was now living with them. Because Franz was already sent to a concentration camp, it was really imperative that he be the one to leave. And we have in his date book here, these pages are left blank after the 12th because he has been arrested. But we do see, if you look more closely, I don't know how big your screen is, he's still listing some places to go to, because the family knows that this is a desperate situation. And it wasn't only this family that realized that. In 1938, we see the visas increasing. And this is after the Evian conference failed. So moving forward, they are able to secure passage for him on a boat called the Königstein. And the Königstein was originally supposed to go to Trinidad and Tobago, but it was denied entry. It was denied the opportunity to allow the passengers to disembark. And in their desperation, the boat went to Venezuela. And Venezuela gave them temporary refuge. They gave them up to 2 months to stay in Venezuela with the hope that the passengers would be able to secure papers and permission to go elsewhere. So here we see the date book, and we see the mention of Caracas. We also see the mention of Puerto Rico. He is looking for places to go. And he does end up in Guyana. He does end up in Venezuela. And meantime, his wife and son are still in Vienna. But his sister, Franz had a sister who had been able to go to Havana, Cuba, in early 1939. And he's able to go to Cuba and join her there. And he is in this picture. I'm still not really sure which one he is, but this was a picture that the family gave to us. So he goes from Venezuela to Cuba. And while he's there with his sister, he receives permission from the Cuban government. And here's a letter in Spanish telling him that his wife and his son may join him in Cuba. So he's able to book and purchase tickets for them to sail to Cuba on a boat called the St. Louis. So in the next slide, this is a picture of his wife, Elsa, with some of the other passengers on the St. Louis. And we're going to now watch a video that we have. I'm going to stop my screen share. Do a little maneuvering here. We're going to play this video. This is a short 8-minute video that we have in our exhibition, Americans, the Holocaust. And it gives us the background of the boat, the St. Louis, and it also gives us a background of another boat, the Kwanzaa, that first went to Mexico. Now, I just want to point out that these two boats, the fates of these two boats and the passengers, these are atypical stories. This was not the norm. The St. Louis has become very popular and kind of mythologized with this history. But as we watch this particular video, this really gives us the true context of the St. Louis and also of this boat called the Kwanzaa. So I'm going to show that now.
On May 13, 1939, the MS St. Louis, a German passenger ship, began its journey from Hamburg to Havana, Cuba. The ship carried 937 passengers. Most were Jews seeking temporary refuge in Cuba as they waited for immigration visas to the United States. When the ship arrived in Havana, most of the passengers were not allowed to disembark. They had unknowingly purchased fraudulent landing permits from a corrupt Cuban government official. The ship sat in the harbor for nearly 1 week while a relief agency called the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, known as the Joint, tried to persuade the Cuban government to admit the refugees. After negotiations broke down, the ship steered toward Miami, Florida. The refugees and their supporters on land appealed to the public, the press, and even to President Roosevelt and the First Lady. The president never responded, and the State Department did not take any measures to admit the St. Louis passengers. As the ship crossed the Atlantic on its return to Germany, the Joint's European director, Morris Troper, worked tirelessly with State Department staff in Western Europe to find safe havens for the passengers. Troper's last-ditch efforts were successful. 4 Western European countries, Belgium, France, Great Britain, and the Netherlands, issued entry visas to the St. Louis passengers. They would not be forced to return to Nazi Germany. But the passengers were not safe from future danger because Nazi Germany soon invaded 3 of the countries where they had landed. Many of the passengers were still on the waiting list for U.S. immigration visas 1 year later, but immigration to the United States was nearly impossible. Of the 937 passengers on the St. Louis, 254 were murdered by Nazi Germany and its collaborators during World War II. In August 1940, the SS Kwanzaa sailed from Lisbon to New York, carrying more than 300 passengers. Most were Jewish refugees. Europe had been at war for nearly a year, and it was getting even harder for refugees to cross the Atlantic Ocean. 200 Kwanzaa passengers who held U.S. immigration visas disembarked in New York. The remaining passengers, who did not have U.S. visas, continued to Veracruz, Mexico. Mexico, however, claimed that at least 80 of the passengers did not have the right paperwork. Their admission was denied. When the Kwanzaa's passengers realized that the ship would stop in Norfolk, Virginia to refuel before returning to Lisbon, they sent frantic telegrams to family members, Jewish organizations, and the U.S. government. Eleanor Roosevelt expressed her personal interest in the fate of the refugees. One family on board hired Jacob Morwitz, a local Virginia attorney, who sued the shipping company for failing to deliver the passengers to their intended destination. Many other passengers also filed suits. A federal judge ordered the ship to stay in Norfolk while Morwitz's case was reviewed by the court. While the ship waited in Norfolk, the State Department investigated the remaining passengers. All were allowed to disembark in the United States. The Kwanzaa passengers sent letters of gratitude to the State Department and the White House, including flowers for the First Lady. But Assistant Secretary of State Breckinridge Long was angry about being forced to admit refugees from the Kwanzaa. He made it clear to U.S. consulates in Europe that the State Department would not tolerate any further incidents in the future.
So we can see from looking at the film that refugees did come to the United States. The St. Louis was not the only boat that ever came here. and over 110,000 refugees were allowed in through New York in a period of 3 years. So these are not your typical stories, but nonetheless, it doesn't make this any less tragic. So this is a picture. Franz is out here in a flotilla going out to greet his wife and son. And if you can't see it, it's kind of small, but there's a little boy right here, and that's Franz on the deck of the Heinz, I'm sorry, that's Heinz on the deck of the St. Louis with his mother and his grandmother, as his father is out on the flotilla. They're not allowed, of course, to stay in Cuba. They go back to Europe, and Elsa and her little boy and her mother-in-law are given refuge in the Netherlands. They're taken in, but in the following year, the Netherlands is overtaken by Germany. It's occupied by Germany. So we do see in our newspaper project, History Unfolded, we do have articles of Spanish language newspapers published in the United States reporting on the voyage of the St. Louis. This is a newspaper from Brownsville, Texas, right on the border, front page news. This is a newspaper from El Mundo that's published in San Juan, Puerto Rico, also again on the front page. The St. Louis was reported on in the mainstream media, newspapers like the New York Times, Washington Post, but these are Spanish language newspapers published here in the United States. La Opinión also included the voyage of the St. Louis on its front page. So in the meantime, while Elsa and her little boy Heinz are in the Netherlands in hiding, Franz goes to Sosua, to the Dominican Republic. So now we see the Dominican Republic again. This is a very different picture from what we saw earlier of him. He is picking bananas, and here he is. He's getting ready to go and try to till the land. We also have pictures of him milking cows. And again, learning new professions. This wasn't easy for a lot of refugees, and a lot of refugees just decided, or a lot of would-be refugees decided that they didn't want to go to the Dominican Republic because the work was too different, the climate was too different, the language was unfamiliar. Thankfully, he was able to go. And one of the reasons why he did go to the Dominican Republic is because he was able to secure visas for his wife and son to join him in the Dominican Republic. But tragically, what happens is that as the war advances and as the Netherlands is overtaken by Germany, his wife and son have to go into hiding, and they separate. The wife, Elsa, decides that she and her little boy should not stay together because eventually one of them they'll be caught, and it's better if they separate so that at least one of them has a chance to survive. And she's actually right. That does happen. She is caught, and she is sent to Westerbork and then Auschwitz. And tragically, she perishes in the Holocaust. Franz, the little boy, is kept in hiding by a Christian family, a very loving family that takes care of him. But these are the letters that go back and forth between Franz, the father, the husband, in the Dominican Republic, trying to learn, well, what's happening? Are the visas reaching my wife and my little boy? So they have visas to go to the Dominican Republic, but what they lack are exit visas to leave Europe, because by this time, the consulates close. By the summer of 1941, the US consulates and all of the consulates in Nazi-occupied Europe are forced to close. And so you can no longer go there to get a visa to leave. And tragically, that is what happens, and she does not survive. And these are some of the documents in the collection. But had they been able to secure exit visas, if time had been on their side, and this had been maybe 6 months earlier, they probably would have been able to leave. So these are some letters that we have from Dorsa that is helping them to try to bring the family over to the Dominican Republic. And what happens with the Dominican Republic is the war and the United States entering the war. And the United States quits providing financial support for the Sosua project, because now that we're in the war, our money, our funding needs to go to other sources. Another thing that happens with the Dominican Republic and with a lot of the countries in the both sides on the Pacific and the Atlantic side is the fear of German U-boats. It makes it very dangerous for ships to be coming over into Latin America because of the threat of being torpedoed. And that actually does happen to a boat that is near Mexico. It's a Mexican boat that is sunk by the Germans. And that's what causes Mexico to go inside with the Allies and enter the war, which I'll talk about in a minute. But these are some other pictures that we have of the Dominican Republic in our files. And I get asked this question, does SS stand for the SS that we commonly think of perpetrators? And no, it does not. One of the S's stands actually for Sosua. I'm not sure what the other S stands for. But if you look on the back, you see in Spanish, Servicio de Leche. So these are Austrian Jewish refugees now living in Sosua, delivering bananas. You can see the bananas on the back, and milk. And again, very different from what they might have been doing for a living when they were in Austria. And this picture is particularly meaningful. This is a preschool class at La Escuela Cristóbal Colón, the Christopher Columbus School in Sosua. This is a picture in 1945. These are the children that were born to refugees. Now, if you look closely at the picture, you notice that there are some children who are of a mixed background. Most of the refugees, especially in the beginning, who went to Sosua were males, young men. And there weren't as many women who went. So many of the men ended up marrying local women and starting families with them. And so this is a picture of those children that were born to the refugees while in Sosua. And interestingly enough, some years ago when we were having our 20th anniversary, I was showing this picture at a talk that I was giving in Los Angeles. And this little boy happened to be in the audience, and he ended up donating more pictures to us of his pre-K classmates. So Sosua still exists today, and there is actually a museum in Sosua that is dedicated to this history, and we have worked with them to secure some of the records from there. So looking at Mexico, and I'm going to go a little faster here because I know we've all been sitting for some time. Mexico's situation was very different from the rest of the Latin American countries. It had the only democratically elected government. Mexico was much more liberal than the rest of the countries in the Americas, and it also prided itself on its immigration policy that favored people who were fighting for democratic principles. So in other words, Mexico wanted to bring over refugees who were trying to defend democracy and defend liberal ideas. And in particular, Mexico was very fond and advocating to bring Spanish Republicans who were fleeing Spain and who needed refuge after they were defeated in the Spanish Civil War. So here we have a picture of the then President Cárdenas from Mexico with the children of Spanish Republicans who had gone to Mexico. So Mexico's policy was perceived to be very liberal, but it starts to that starts to change. I want to go back here though and mention one thing about Mexico. When the Anschluss took place in March of 1938, the annexation of Austria as part of the Third Reich, Mexico was the only country in the League of Nations, the only member state in the League of Nations that issued a formal declaration of outcry against the Third Reich for going into Austria. It was the only country that protested the annexation. It was also very vocal in protesting Kristallnacht in November of 1938. But that did not mean that Mexico would take in Jewish refugees. So I do want to talk about some of the outcry that we see in Mexico. There were, for at least 2 years after Kristallnacht, there were commemorations that were calling out the Nazis. Now, there was a smaller Nazi party, the Gold Shirts, in Mexico at the time, but they didn't really have a great impact in Mexico. They did fight out in the streets many times against some liberal groups, some communists and some socialist groups. But for the most part, again, Mexico by this time is starting to close its doors, except to Spanish Republicans. But in the mix of the Spanish Republicans who are going to Mexico, we do see some Jewish refugees as well. There were quite a few German and Austrian Jews who had gone to Spain in the 1930s to fight alongside Spanish Republicans against the Franco regime. But when they lost, many of them fled to France. And by this time, France, by 1940, by the summer of 1940, France is overtaken by Germany. And France is essentially split into two. We have the Vichy government, which we know now as a largely collaborationist government. And within the Vichy government, Marseille was one of the few cities that you could go to where there were consular offices. If you were able to make it there, you could possibly, if you had any luck, you could be given a visa. And this young man, Nicholas Bodek, we know that he's Jewish. He's listed as being Israelita, an Israelite, which was a common term that was used in Latin America to describe somebody who was Jewish. This was issued to him in November of 1941. And we know from the film that we just watched that the consular offices in German-occupied, Nazi-occupied Europe were closed. But he is able to make it to Marseille, and he is given a visa, and this is his immigration card to go to Mexico. We see the stamp, we see the eagle from Mexico. And he's given this visa by a consulate named Gilberto Vosquez. Now, Gilberto Vosquez is popularly called the Mexican Schindler. And this is a picture of Vosquez. He has not been recognized by the state of Israel, by Yad Vashem, as a righteous Gentile, because there's a lot of debate around him still as to whether or not he accepted bribes and in exchange for money issued visas. It's still not clear how true that is or not. What we can say about Gilberto Vosquez is that he was a veteran of the Mexican Revolution, and there's a lot of connection between the Mexican Revolution and this history. He was a good friend of President Cárdenas. He rose up through the ranks of the consular corps. He was posted in Marseille, and he was very sympathetic to liberal and communist causes. So he did issue, from what we've heard, up to 40,000 visas to refugees, allowing them to go to Mexico, primarily to a lot of Spanish Republicans, but within there were many Jewish refugees who had fought alongside the Spanish Republicans, because Mexico, if you remember what I said earlier, Mexico was priding itself on giving refuge to people who were fighting for democracy and for liberal causes. But Vosquez, like many other people who were trying to help refugees, he was put under house arrest by the Germans. And Mexico still had at this time diplomatic relations with the Vichy government. So Mexico was able to secure his release. And here's a picture of him arriving in Mexico City. And the people who are welcoming him are the refugees who he helped to save. And among them were Jewish refugees who he had granted visas to. This is a short clip from a woman named Nellie Wolf. And I'm going to speed it up a little because we don't have a lot of time. But she went to Mexico through a visa given to her as a child. She's from Vienna. She was able to go to Mexico with her family. And when she's going to Mexico, she's on a boat with Spanish Republicans. And she doesn't know any Spanish. And what she knows of Mexico is based on a lot of stereotypes. But I'm going to just play a snippet of her testimony.
There was this Mexican consul in
Can you hear it? Okay.
Marseille called Gilberto Bosque.
Let me move this.
That's a language I had never, whatever. And I just watched on the deck and then.
Okay, let me move it. Okay, here she's talking about the boat.
What I remember is that the Spaniards would go on the deck and then sing and dance and whatever. And I just watched and say, my God, that's a language I had never heard. I'm going to speak that in Mexico.
What were you told about where you were going, and how did you feel about it?
Information was very scarce and misleading. We were told that there were Indians with arrows and bows and whatever. There was lots of oil and silver. Period. That was all the information we had about Mexico. And but we were told, of course, that Spanish was spoken here, and I just listened to those people and wouldn't understand much. But I liked their dancing and their singing. They were much happier than the German-speaking people.
Okay, so she's talking about the Spanish Republicans on the boat with her. And she ended up staying in Mexico for the rest of her life. So what Mexico was trying to do was, after the Mexican Revolution, it was also in its own way subscribing to a kind of racial ideology. And that was to build up its identity as a nation of mestizos. So mestizos are people who are of mixed background, partly indigenous and partly Spanish. And so with that in mind, their immigration policy was kind of like our policy, in that they wanted people who would fulfill a kind of racial, a racial ideal. And so this is a picture of the racial ideal in Mexico. And so if you're an Eastern European, you probably would not fit this ideal. It also, even though it became very anti-clerical and at this point was very pretty much anti-Catholic, it still honored people who had a kind of Catholic cultural identity. So that was why Mexico also favored Spanish Republicans, because they shared a lot of the same Latin culture. They shared a language, and even though they tended to be, many of the Spanish Republicans and many of the people in the leadership of Mexico tended to be more agnostic, secular, atheist, they still were raised with a lot of the Catholic culture that you see that's so prevalent in Mexico even today. So that was why it was also very difficult if you were Jewish to go to Mexico, because you didn't necessarily fit into this kind of identity that Mexico was trying to build. So now we're jumping into Mexican Americans in the United States. And in May of 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act is signed into law. And this is the Immigration Restriction Act. This is it's also known as the National Quota Act, because now if you want to come to the United States, the quotas are very much slanted to favor people who are born in certain countries. So even if you're now living in another country that's different from the country in which you were born, you have to come through the quotas. You have to be allowed only in through the quotas that fit the country from where you were born. And that's going to cause grave problems in the 1930s for Jewish refugees who want to come, especially those coming from Eastern European countries. The Great Depression also has a major impact on on immigration policy because of the fear that immigrants will become an economic burden that we cannot sustain when we cannot feed our own. So into this, with that in mind, the repatriation of Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals starts to take place actually in 1929. This is a profound history that unfortunately a lot of Americans aren't even familiar with, but this had a very grave impact on some of the major cities in the United States, in California, in Texas, in Florida, Michigan, Illinois, New York. So we have started in our History Unfolded project, we have started collecting and asking for newspaper articles about the repatriation of Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals. And how does this relate to the Holocaust? Well, again, this helps us to broaden our understanding of the attitudes that many Americans had toward minorities, people of color, and also people who had come from other countries who were now living in the United States. The repatriation was basically a program to encourage, and in most cases to force, Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals to go back to Mexico. And what's really tragic about this is that 60% of those who were quote unquote repatriated were American-born citizens. They were not naturalized, they were born in the United States. And this program did not end until the 1950s. And really, there were echoes of it still in the 1960s until the immigration laws were changed. So this is from La Opinión, again, a Spanish language newspaper published in Los Angeles, and this is from the El Paso Times. We have over 100 articles, and we're still collecting articles on a range of topics. I'll talk about that at the workshop in April. So here we have the story of Anthony Acevedo. Anthony Acevedo was a Mexican American born in Pasadena, California to Mexican immigrants. When he is 13 years old, his family is repatriated to Mexico. Now, they were in the United States legally, but at the time when authorities came to their home, his mother did not have all the paperwork on her. So tragically, the family is forced out of California, and they have to go to Mexico, and they go to Durango, Mexico, where they had family members. So he's 13 years old when this happens. So he spends those formative teenage years in Durango, Mexico. But when the war breaks out, he has to enlist because he is an American-born citizen, even though he was forced to go to Mexico with his family. He is drafted into the Army. And he's very proud to serve in the Army, even though his family had been treated very unfairly, and that's an understatement. He trains as a medic in the Army, and you can see him right here in this picture. Mr. Acevedo kept a diary from the time he goes to Europe, and while he's also taken as a prisoner of war. We learned of his story in 2008. CNN did a feature on him, and this is a picture from an interview. This is a screenshot of an interview with him that CNN did, where he's talking about this diary that he has. So Mr. Acevedo tragically was captured during the Battle of the Bulge, and he became a prisoner of war. But from there, he and 350 of his fellow prisoners of war, who were American men, were selected to go to a concentration camp called Berga, which is a subcamp of Buchenwald in Germany. And the reason why they were selected is because they were either Jewish, they were perceived to be Jewish, they had Jewish-sounding last names. And in Mr. Acevedo's case, he was selected to go because of the fact that he was Mexican and therefore deemed to be racially inferior. What's extraordinary about his story is that he kept a diary while in captivity. And in 2010, this is Mr. Acevedo meeting with Kira Schuster, my wonderful colleague who worked with the family for 2 years to gain their trust, to donate the collection to the museum. And that's me overlooking his shoulder. We interviewed him for his oral testimony. Kira did the English portion and I interviewed him in Spanish, and you can find it on our website. It's unedited right now, so I didn't include it in here, but this is Mr. Acevedo with his diary in his hand. And he gave it to us. It was a very moving ceremony. And he also gave us another collection of documents, letters, pictures. This is a picture of him in Belgium. So his story for us is incredibly special. This is a picture of the front of his diary. You can find his diary in our collections. We have it digitized. It's available on our website. And it's a very easy read, but it's a very extraordinary read because he is a medic and he keeps track of all of the men, his fellow POWs, his fellow American citizens, who he's trying to heal, trying to take care of their wounds and their illnesses while they're in Berga and they're being tortured and starved. And he keeps these meticulous records in his diaries of the men. And he speaks very eloquently and very tragically of some of these men dying in his arms. He also speaks about how some of them are Jewish, and he being Catholic, how they're both trying to observe, in the Jewish men's case, Passover, and he's trying to observe Good Friday and Easter at the same time. And he draws these wonderful but very sad sketches of the forced labor, of the slave labor that was put upon them in the camps. But he also writes very much about his longing for home. What is his family in Durango and Mexico doing? Because his family at this time is still in Mexico. They're not allowed to come back to the United States, even though they were here legally and he was born in the United States. So in a way, it's what we call spiritual resistance. He's writing to stay in touch with that part of him that keeps his sense of humanity. He also draws sketches of some of the pinup girls from the calendars that they were given. So Mr. Acevedo passed away in 2018, but his family remains in touch with the museum. And his story encompasses the treatment of minorities in the United States. It encompasses the repatriation of Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals to Mexico, which was a forced deportation. But it also encompasses the history of the Holocaust in that he was sent to a concentration camp. And it really helps to expand our lens of who the victims of Nazi persecution were. So thank you so much for listening to all of this evening. It really means a lot. I hope that you learned something new, and I hope that you stay in touch with us because as we continue to collect the records of the Holocaust, it really helps for us to expand on this history. History is not something that is static. The more that we receive from around the world, the more we are able to find these histories that are unknown. So thank you very much. And thank you again to our wonderful partners in Alabama for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Christina. So we do have space for people to put questions in the chat box. If you have questions or comments, I can share those with Chris. I do have a question.
Sure.
The Jewish men or families who ended up in the Dominican Republic, of those that went there, do you have any idea how many either stayed and or remained Jewish?
Yes, so most of them, that's a very good question. Not very many stayed, probably less than 100 families. And then even of the family members, many of them either came to the United States or they went to other countries in Latin America, and some also went to Israel. So what we do know though is that the synagogue stayed active. And even today it's still open, but I'm not sure how active it is. And there are still descendants of the refugees who went there, who are still living there. And actually the dairy plant that they started is still producing dairy products to this day.
Okay. Does anybody else have questions? If you would type it in. We do have a comment thanking you so much. It was very enlightening.
Oh, well, thank you, Esther. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you this evening. And I do want to stress that when we look at Latin America, we have to remember that it's several countries and not, there isn't just one monolithic experience. When we have the workshop in April, I will talk more about Bolivia, in Argentina, and Chile, because they all had very distinct histories and distinct responses. Some of them had active Jewish communities already, some of them did not. The Dominican Republic, for example, had a very almost no Jewish community prior to this. And if they did have a Jewish community, they were further inland in the Dominican Republic.
Yeah, and I do want to reiterate what Chris said, that if you would like to come to our teacher workshop, we're not going to be doing teachery things that much. It's going to be a different format, more of a lecture type format. So you are welcome to come to our teacher workshop. Just sign up online.
And I will share that wonderful drawing that Anne referred to. It's one of my favorite documents that we have.
So Esther's asked, was the son reunited with his father? I guess she's talking about Heinz.
Yes. Heinz was reunited with his father in the United States in 1946. So Franz learns that his wife and his mother perished, but he still didn't know what had happened to his son. And shortly after that, he learns that his son is still alive. He's given a picture of his son. By this time, his son is 10 years old. Now, keep in mind, when the last time he saw his son was in 1938, when his son was only 3 years old. So when his son is reunited with him, he doesn't know his father. He doesn't really have any memory of his father. They're reunited, and it was difficult for them. But they did stay close, but they did have some difficulties in their relationship. And we have the Blumenstein papers on our website. They're digitized, you can find them. And there are letters between the father and son, and the father writes to him like in the 1970s saying, look, I did the best I could. Your mother was gone. And Heinz, who now goes by Henry, he lives just not too far from where I live in Silver Spring, and he donated all of these papers to us. So that's how we know the story. But yes, they were reunited.
And Chelsea says she's a Spanish teacher in Mobile, and she appreciates this webinar and looks forward to the workshop.
Oh, Chelsea, thank you so much. Chelsea, the Spanish language newspapers that I showed, that's a lesson plan that we have in English and Spanish on the voyage of the St. Louis. So I encourage you to look at that. We have many resources, our Holocaust Encyclopedia. We have hundreds of articles that we've translated in Spanish. And I do want to say that now it is a high priority for us to translate our lessons now into Spanish. We feel strongly that we need to reach the Spanish-speaking audience, not only in the United States, but in the Americas and Spain, around the world, because 400 million people in the world speak Spanish. So we really welcome your use and your comments. And Don, thank you so much for being here. Dr. Don Berry, who's one of our Czech partners as well, the Gulf Coast Center. It's just such a pleasure to be with all of you. But yes, please, if you want, please sign up for the April program, because we will look at some other countries as well.
Okay, so I also want to remind everybody that there will be a statewide Yom HaShoah program on April the 11th, Sunday, April the 11th. It's going to be at 2 o'clock and it's going to all be pre-recorded on Zoom. And it should be really interesting. We have a lot of guest speakers that are coming in to speak. So check that out on our website as well. And that's about it for the evening. Thank you all for spending your evening with us. And thank you, Christine, for sharing with us tonight.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure. And I hope that we can see each other in person sometime soon.
All right.
Have a
Thank
good
you,
evening.
everybody.